Have you ever been told, or maybe you just thought this up all by yourself, that if you want to accomplish anything in life, you're going to have to learn to push through your fears? Well, if you have, you've been given some really bad advice. Stick with me. I'm going to tell you why this is not good advice, and I'm going to show you a better way. Hey, welcome to Craig Walker Coaching. My name is Craig Walker, and I am grateful that you are here with me today. I have a talk that I think is really going to help you, maybe just what you need to transform your life. We'll talk about dealing with your fears. Before we jump into that, let me remind you that if you've not subscribed to my channel, make sure that you do. Be sure and ring the bell so that you're notified each time a new video is posted. And as always, don't forget to leave your question and comments down below. Now then, back to the talk. This is why we're here. I'm excited about it. This is a friend of mine and we were on a road trip together. We were listening to a podcast which led to a conversation about fears. So I asked my friend, I said, do you have any unhealthy fears? And he said, not that I'm aware of. Then he paused for a little thought and said, but when I do come up against something where I'm afraid, he said, I just push through my fears. Well, I thought that's what I've always been taught too. If you fall off a horse, you get back on. Push through, ignore, or face your fears. When I was about 10 years old, my dad put me on what I'm calling a terribly untrained horse named Sam. When I mounted Sam, he bolted and ran to the back of this 40-acre pasture. Now, arriving at the back fence, he slid to a stop, spun around, and headed back towards the barn. The problem was, when Sam stopped and spun, my little bottom became unattached from the saddle, and I unintentionally did some trick riding all the way back up to the front of the pasture. I was on his side, I was under his belly, and then, by the way, when he gets back to the barn, I look up and I see the gate that he's about to run through, and I could imagine my head being torn off. And so I decided to let loose, and I did. I bailed, and I plowed up a manure-strewn pasture with my nose and with my mouth. Now, let me just ask you, what do you think my dad did at that point? He grabbed me up, brushed me off, and said, get back on the horse. Like, there'll be time to deal with your bloody nose and bloody lip, but right now, you got to face your fear of getting killed by a horse. You can't let fear keep you from doing what you want to do. And I'm thinking now, looking back on it, who in the world was doing what they wanted to do? Okay, I got to confess, I have a deep love for horses. So I really did want to ride Sam. In fact, every time I got a chance to ride Sam, I pushed through my fear and I rode him. I was scared to death, though, every time I got on his back. But I did notice something. Over time, my fear lessened. But, being transparent, it was years before I totally got over my fear of getting hurt while riding a horse. Now, honestly, you've probably been told that too. Or you've thought that, haven't you? Push through your fears, ignore your fears, face your fears. That's just bad advice, though. Let me tell you why. When you push through your fears, you do learn something about yourself, and that's not bad. You learn something about the fear, and fear slowly lessens over time. But here's the problem. Often, you never completely deal with the fear, and it always maintains some level of control over your life. That's why I say there's a better way. And here it is. I want you to write this down. Are you ready? Faith through your fears. Yeah, don't push through, don't ignore, but faith through your fears. When you faith through your fears, this is trusting God. You learn something about God, that He's greater than anything that you ever feared. In the Bible, one of my favorite books in the Old Testament, the book of Daniel, we see this truth graphically lived out by Daniel and his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, these four young men, along with other Jewish captives, they had been chosen to participate in a 3-year apprenticeship program. And at the end of this 3-year program, they were to be brought in to serve in the king's royal palace. Now, all those chosen were to be fed food and wine from the king's own kitchen. So it sounds like a really good deal, right? I mean, they got the plush job for captives. But there is a problem. You see, eating food and drinking this wine was forbidden by the Jewish law. So Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and the wine given to them by the king. So rather than go along with the crowd for the sake of acceptance, fitting in, avoiding punishment, or just not looking like a religious weirdo, Daniel asked the chief of staff for permission not to eat those unacceptable foods. Daniel, rather, offered an alternative that didn't defile his conscience as a 10-day fast. The chief agreed, and Daniel's 3 friends all joined in. Now, I don't want you to miss this. This is important, okay? Daniel and his 3 friends were only 4 of the young Jewish captives who were chosen. All of them lived under the same Jewish law, but only Daniel and his friends decided not to violate their conscience. Now watch what happens. At the end of the 10 days, Daniel and his 3 friends looked healthier and better nourished than the young men who had been eating the food assigned to them by the king. Incredible. Watch what else happens. They're just learning something about God. At the end of 3 years, God gave these 4 young men an unusual aptitude for understanding every aspect of literature and wisdom. And when the training period was over, when it was completed, the chief of staff brought all these young men to the king Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, but watch this. No one impressed him as much as Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, let me just pause here and interject a personal thought. I really don't think this was their first time to faith through their fears. Because as you keep reading the book of Daniel, you discover that they know something about God. They had a deep knowledge of God, and they really don't seem to be afraid of anything. So, honestly, you and I should not be surprised when we see Daniel and his 3 friends' courage. When the 3 friends refused to bow down worshiping the king's golden statue rather than be thrown into the fiery furnace, for them, God was greater than the king's wrath, and he was sure greater than death by fire. You see, neither should we be surprised at Daniel's boldness and courage when he was ordered not to pray to his God anymore, or else he would be thrown into the lion's den, because Daniel understood something about God, that God is greater than lions. You see, when you push through your fears, you do learn something about yourself, and you learn something about your fear, and your fear begins to lessen over time. But honestly, it just never, ever loses its total control over your life. If you want to be totally free, you've got to learn to faith through your fears. And when you faith through your fears, you learn that God is greater than anything that you could ever fear. So here's a question I have for you. What unhealthy fear do you have? Are you afraid of rejection? Feeling like, I don't fit in. Feeling like you're not worthy of love and belonging? Are you afraid of failure? Feeling like you just aren't good enough, not smart enough, talented enough, gifted enough, pretty enough, strong enough, or whatever enough you're thinking? You see, most of my life, I lived with the fear of rejection and failure. And so what I do, I keep pushing through my fear. My fear slowly lessened. I learned something about myself. I learned something about the fear. But the truth is, it never, ever went away. And it always maintained some measure of control over my life. Not until I discovered that I could faith through my fear did I learn that God is greater than anything that I've ever feared. And now I'm free from fear. Fear has no control over me. It was the psalmist David, the greatest king of all time, I think, that wrote this. He said, when I'm afraid, I will put my trust in God. What incredible application for you and me. Anytime, every time you sense fear, it's an opportunity to know God better. Make it your mantra. When I am afraid, I will put my trust in God. And how do you faith through? Let's talk about that. Well, you decide that you will not violate your conscience before God. Is there something you're doing out of fear that will defile your conscience? It will. If you're doing anything or not doing anything because of fear, if that's your motivation, it'll defile your conscience. Why? Because the scripture says that whatever does not proceed or come from or motivated by faith, that's sin. And that will defile your conscience. So rather than going along with the crowd, to be accepted, to fit in, to not look like a religious weirdo. You faith through and you discover that God is greater than your fear of rejection. That's right. Rather than living in fear of failure, faith through your fear and learn that God is greater than failure. Does this mean that you'll never live in fear again? No, it means that fear will lose its control over you and you will learn to live with more peace, more joy, more confidence, more boldness than you ever imagined possible, and you will begin to experience the life that you were born to love. Well, my name is Craig Walker. I do help people break free from the paralysis of self-doubt, which is often just caused by fear. If you think I can help you, send me an email at craigwalkercoaching.com or craig@craigwalkercoaching.com. I'll be happy to respond to you. Let's start a conversation. This is what God has gifted me to do. Let me help you win. Don't stay stuck in your fear. That's all I've got for today. Thanks so much for joining me, and I will see you next time.